Welcome to another episode of Management Muse. I'm your host, Cindi Baldi, and this is my husband and co-host, Geoffrey Tumlin.
Yellow! Welcome to the podcast where we try to inspire better work performance. Thanks for listening.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today on Management Muse. I'm your host, Cindi Baldi, and my co-host across the room, Geoffrey Tumlin.
Yellow!
And today we are talking to you about the concept of reference points, which is like a point that you have in your head about something, and it may be helpful or it may not be very helpful, and how those things might transpire and the way that it impacts your life, probably in ways that maybe you haven't even thought of.
There you go.
Okay.
Give me an example, people.
So I would say, I think maybe the best example is this idea that sometimes we come across people in organizations and their bosses are like, we're trying to motivate this person to produce more. And we've offered them this incentive to produce more.
Yeah.
And, usually money is a pretty good motivator.
Usually money works.
You can just do so much with money.
Usually it works.
And so it's a little surprising when you get somebody where you've structured it where they can get more money and they're like, yeah, I'm good.
Yeah.
And what we have found is that typically those people had a reference point, usually their parents, like whatever lifestyle their parents had, and they wanted to at least meet it, maybe exceed it a little bit, but hadn't really thought about much more of a life than that.
Yeah.
And so that's their reference point, is their parents, and this idea that they wanted to at least be equal to their parents, maybe a little bit better.
Yeah.
And when they hit it, they're like, I'm good. Like, I don't really care that you're offering me a lot of extra money to sell 10 more of these things.
Yeah. Which could be that example, which I agree is common. It could be parents, could be brother, could be somebody you work with that you're kind of comparing to. And then people hit that and they achieve it. And then it's harder to motivate them with money after that. Could be good if they're then
very content.
Yeah, sure.
We have somebody who's working with us right now, tremendously talented person.
Could be doing quadruple.
Has an impressive resume.
Yep.
And that person's just good. They're like, we're like, do you want more?
Yep.
And they're like, I'll let you know.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it could be good, or could be on the other side. If you're stopped and there's a lot more in the tank, then it's like something that Cindi had mentioned in a previous podcast on midlife crises, that as people get older, eventually they hit an inflection point where they stop regretting what they did do. Like, I did that, I can't believe I did that. And they begin regretting what they didn't do. And so to a certain extent, if you're become not complacent, but if you become satisfied too early, there may be this whole upper range of things that you could have done or could have been or could have achieved that you don't.
Well, and I think that on the downside of this, and we're speaking right now, the reference points are all over the place. They're big in negotiation. We'll get into that. But like, I think the downside is that people who actually are working pretty hard and feel like they're trying to achieve, that they just don't even see the possibility of what might be beyond the reference point.
Totally. Yeah, totally. There's a guy I'm thinking of, and I could actually give you the numbers on this. This guy, his business unit that he's basically responsible for, their revenue is $12 million. And he's the child of immigrants who, the typical immigrant story to America. They saved every penny, they work like dogs, this, that, and the other. And so this guy has wildly surpassed his parents' achievements. And yet other people running comparative businesses have double the revenue. And he cannot be convinced that he isn't a success. And he is. Their revenue is $12 million. He makes a great salary. You know, he's wildly surpassed what his parents would have been able to achieve. But his business actually is underperforming.
I mean, when you compare organization to organization in that industry, they're actually underperforming.
They're underperforming, and he can't be convinced otherwise. And that is a reference group problem.
His reference is back to what he grew up with.
Sure.
That he's wildly succeeded. But his actual reference point in terms of like success in business
should be the competitors.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which gets to another piece of this that is worth talking about, is getting the right comparison others. Sometimes in the literature, this is called, comparison other. Very similar. In fact, I think they're synonymous. I
think that they're absolutely, comparison to others are a reference point. It's just depending on whether or not you're in, like, I would say the negotiation literature, which that's more reference point and often is more like money focused or, like something concrete that you're getting in exchange for something.
Yeah. Versus
the social sciences and management, where like oftentimes our reference point is a human being.
Yeah. I think that jives with my understanding as well. Thanks for that clarification. So this idea of getting the right comparison others and not penalizing yourself. I mean, we joke about this a lot, but I have to catch myself sometimes. Is a lot of my cousins have been wildly financially successful.
And we're happy for them.
We are absolutely happy. But when I'm around, like when they all gather together and I'm around a bunch of them, like we're the only ones not driving Lamborghinis. And so.
Yeah, but we wouldn't anyway. We're too cheap.
It is right. We got a Honda.
I love my Honda.
Yeah, I know. Nothing wrong with it. You have to catch yourself that, like, wait a minute, these people actually aren't my comparisons. My more accurate comparisons are people doing similar work to what I'm doing, who've had a similar education. And an even better comparison in a perfect world, an even better comparison would be me comparing myself to me from a year ago or from 2 years ago. And have I grown, and have I done better, and have I learned, and have I been kinder, and have we made a little more money? All these ways of comparing me to a previous me.
Well, that's the easiest comparison because
and more healthy.
Everything and more healthy psychologically, because the problem with comparison to others is like it can really be like what Geoff was describing. It can be really a drag.
Yeah.
Like you love your cousins, and if you let it get to you, that can actually be a drag on you mentally.
Yes, and it would be nice to just focus on me and my own improvements. But in the actual world, we're social beings. And we're constantly.
Well, it's the only way that we have any idea of how we're doing. So I tend to be like my comparison to others tend to be my past self.
So she's not normal.
I'm not, and I know I'm not normal that way. Right. But I'm also very happy.
Yes, that's true.
But I do understand that like we're just trying to figure out sort of how we're doing compared to other people, and like there's no real clear metrics other than like either relying on your past self or by looking around, especially if you're like trying to do something that maybe like you're not really great at. Maybe you're trying to get a little bit better and you just need to be able to see like, okay, well, that person's been doing this for so many years and they're still struggling on this, and so I'm not doing too bad. I picked this up a year ago. Like there's a reason why, because otherwise like you kind of just don't even know where you're placed. Like it's hard to assess how you're doing without comparison to others.
Yeah. And so I would say the first, or one of the places where they go wrong is that we are picking others instead of ourselves, and then we penalize ourselves by thinking that we should be as good as whoever. I remember the first time I was doing a paper with John Daly at the University of Texas. And basically I wasn't good enough to do the paper. So I would just sit there in his office and he would be doing all the writing and the typing, right? And I would just watch him for the literature review type reference after reference, like from his mind, like boom, boom, okay, and then this connects here, and okay, we're saying this, and then we're saying this, blah, blah. And I remember thinking, I'm not a little bit away from this guy. I'm like light years from being anything like this. And it wasn't demotivating necessarily, but I also realized the guy was my mentor, but I wasn't going to be able to compare myself to him for a very, very, very long time.
Right. And that's the key thing with like the comparisons is that they need to be as close to you as possible, which is one of the reasons why the self one is actually a pretty effective one, because we just don't know how to do the calculus. Like how do you measure being a PhD student who's been at it for a couple of years to a guy who has decades and books and just amazing research behind him? Okay, so you wrote a good article for a journal. Like, is that a reasonable improvement?
Right.
Like, who knows?
Yeah.
But you look at the other students, especially ones who you think got it together, and now you can be like, okay, all right, I'm kind of on track.
Yeah. Yeah. So trying to pick, if you're going to pick external to yourself, a comparison other that's accurate, that's close to you, around where you are in education, around where you are in terms of your career, around where you are roughly in terms of experience. I think sometimes they call that optimal comparison, having an optimal person that you're comparing to. And so that's, I think, one of the first main points about these comparison others. I think that it's also helpful to talk about reminding yourself. And so this springs from the resilience literature of reminding yourself about the times in your life that you've overcome things, that you've overcome difficulties, that you've done difficult things. And that serves as an accurate or a helpful, productive comparison when you find that you're kind of in a rut. And so that, I think, is a connection to reference points of which part of my life do I compare myself to? A time when I was able to push my way through something and get to the other side of it, or a time when I had more of a struggle. And I think that can be another way that useful reference points are kind of very helpful as it relates to resilience. And then I also think that this idea of having a very kind of grandiose expectations. Ted Houston, also out of the University of Texas.
It's a great university. Hook 'em.
Yep. It's done pretty well documented research on expectations people have when they get married. And the more grandiose.
I think that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. People's expectations are of their marriage, the more trouble they tend to run into. And so again, you're looking at this
a reference point that is like too far. It's almost like the daily reference point for you. Like you're going into a marriage and like it may not actually be an achievable expectation. Yeah.
I forget where I read it, but somewhere in the happiness literature, there was an author a researcher talking about, we make a mistake of thinking that our life is comprised of tens. Like the time we took this cruise and the whale popped up and we saw the tail and all this. Or the time we went to the gourmet dinner and it was in the Serengeti. I mean, I'm just making that up, but that's actually not what our life and our happiness.
It's the daily
It's
small
like
things.
it's like the high 6s and the 7s.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good moment with a friend. It's, laughing and reminiscing over Don Jose.
Don Jose is a Mexican restaurant.
Since 1973.
Is value-based, I will say.
Value-based. It is a good value.
Hello, Musers. Now it's time for commercial break.
Speaking of reference points, why don't you talk a little bit about your survey? It's a good reference point.
All right.
Organization.
So I do a comprehensive survey for organizations that looks at cultural beliefs, communication patterns, like a map communication in the organization, attitudes, fairness, burnout.
Yeah, everything.
And, we try to make the survey so it's 15 minutes. So depending on what the story with the organization, some things may come in, some things may go out. And then there's some customization based on conversations with leadership, with like pain points that they think they're having. And so basically, it returns a lot of good information on multiple dimensions in the organization to try to help leadership figure out what it wants to tackle. And we get together, have a 4-hour session together, run through the results, and come up with, a handful of things. Because you can't do everything in 1 year, but a handful of things that they want to do. And that gives them something to work on. And then we measure it the following year. They get the year-over-year comparisons. There's also some comparisons on a subset of items that are on every one of my surveys. And so they can see how they're doing against, external organizations in their industry. And so there's lots of ways to have a reference point or comparison with the survey. Yeah. I think it's kind of a tool to have a conversation.
Yeah. You don't know how you're doing unless you're measuring it.
If you're interested, we are Culture, which is CULSURE. There is no T in Culture. And
culture.com.
Culture.com. Bring us up.
Yep. It's a good reminder that our life is actually comprised of the day-to-day, and then it's punctuated by some of these great memories, but we're really trying to use a baseball metaphor, hit a bunch of singles and get on base.
I think there's that component to it, but also I think I've seen what sort of overinflated expectations can do to people in at least 2 domains. Like the first is like movies, right? Like, grew up in movie theaters and noticed that one of the things is that when a movie had a lot of hype, there was just no way, like it was gonna bomb because like the expectations for everybody were just so high that like, even if it was a solid movie, people would go out and be like, well, we kind of see it with Star Wars, right? Like Star Wars are good. They're good movies, but you'll have like a whole fraction.
Like episode 900.
Whatever. It doesn't matter.
Star Wars.
The first Star Wars was a surprise, I think. Yeah. But after that, the expectations on every single one of these Star Wars has been so high.
It drove poor Lucas out of the business.
That if like there's a contingent of people out there who every single time are like, this sucks. And I'm like, that was a solid movie, man. There's nothing wrong with that movie. And so I think that plays a part. Like, again, like your reference point is like, you can't even quantify what your reference point was on that movie, but you just know it wasn't met. And I think I see the same thing sometimes like Disney World, because like people dream about taking their families to Disney World and will save for years. And like, I'll be at Disney World. I mean, I've been very fortunate. My sister lives in Florida, so it's not like quite that extreme for us to occasionally go to Disney World. And so, you'll be there and these people are just shelling out the money that is beyond them normally. I'm not saying that they didn't save for it, but like it's beyond normal for them. And they had like this expectation that their kid was just gonna, I don't know, like, again, not really quantifiable, but like somehow be lit up in a way that would just like be amazing.
And you don't think Disney delivers on that?
Sometimes, but you see these families where the expectations were so high and the kid is tired from walking and he's crying and the parents are having like a meltdown because it's not this magical thing that they had built into their head.
Yeah.
And so those are the two places that I've seen like sort of expectations out of control.
Yeah.
Like you should expect if you go to Disney, your kid is going to be exhausted. So, rent the stroller, like do the things that like have a day in between parks to rest.
Yeah.
Do the things to set them up for success after like spending the money. Like save a little bit longer and be able to actually do this thing right. You'll get closer to those expectations, but also like I think at some level, some of these people coming in, like the expectations are just so grand that I'm not sure that their kid could have ever delivered or Disney could have ever delivered this combination of the two.
Yeah. 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 I mean, it reminds me of like you and I have a rule that we basically never stay at 5-star hotels. And partly, of course, it's because we haven't found them to be worth it in the few times that we have. But the other part is that people aren't happy there. Mm-hmm. People are far less, in our experience, 5-star hotels are filled with mostly people who can afford it. And their expectations are they're just terrible guests. And they find fault with even immaculate settings.
Right, because they have paid a fortune, and so there's a little bit.
And it's reference point. It's expectation.
It's reference point because they're used to basically perfection, getting what they want. I don't know. Yeah,
you're used to it. And so you're not, as opposed to when we go to a 4-star place, 4-star hotels are filled with people who normally stay at 3 stars. And I mean,
and there are a lot of families there.
Yeah, even we're a good example. If we normally we're at a Hampton Inn or Fairfield Inn, 3-star, straight up.
Right.
And then when we're on vacation, we'll go up to a 4-star, and that feels good. We're actually somewhere where we're usually not. Same thing for families that you mentioned before. They save up, and now they're going to a 4-star hotel for their summer vacation. People are generally happier because the expectation is I'm normally 3 and now I'm occasionally at a 4. So look, it's just all in the same neighborhood of we are often guilty of having the wrong expectations or the wrong reference point or the wrong comparison other to our detriment. And if it's other people we're comparing to, it would be more helpful if you could take some of Cindy's mutation and try only to compare yourself to yourself. If you can't, and you're more normal like me on this, then at least try to find somebody more accurate to compare to.
And when you find that you're getting really upset, you may want to think about whether or not you have the right comparison.
Right.
Which is what you were doing with your cousins. Like that was your your backstop, right? Like, wait a second, I'm not even in their industry. Like,
right. What am I doing? Yeah.
Right.
And one's in finance, 2 are in real estate. I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
Right. Like that. Yeah. That's like me because my degree is management. Geoff's degree is communication. There's a lot of overlap between the two, obviously, in organizations. But that's like me working at a university, knowing that the finance department, like anybody working in a finance department at a university, is making double what management's making.
Right. And management's making double what communication is making.
And you can't care because I made a choice not to be finance.
Yeah. Yeah. I know somebody, it's been a while, but basically a communication guy thought he should be paid like a management person.
I remember that person.
Yeah. And just was never happy. The wrong reference point. I mean, you're commo, you picked that discipline. You may or may not have known what you were picking, but you were signing up for.
Well, you maybe
in theory,
do research more before you.
So you're signing up for a degree that pays X and management pays 2X. Well, you should have gotten a management degree. And then within management, finance pays 4X. And so if you're in management, then same thing. It works all the way up the chain. And then those finance people are looking at the people not in academia who are earning
making,
10X.
Yes, they're making
for a hedge
more
fund.
than them.
Yeah. And
which is why they're getting 4X
yes,
in academia
yes,
because like universities
yes,
like we got to do something to try to hold on to these people for a while.
Yeah. So it's a staggeringly dysfunctional mindset if you're not careful. And it creeps up on us because we're social. I mean, a non-trivial part of anybody listening to this who's ever been on a Facebook or an Instagram, like a part of the reason that you feel bad looking through those sites is that there is that feeling gnawing at you that you're not as good as or living up to or having the kind of experiences that all these other people are having.
And the only thing I will say to that is, there could be a constructive component to that. Like if your reference point has been, relatively speaking, low, and then you're experiencing Facebook and you're seeing all these other things people are doing, maybe it's also time to maybe think, like you can't all of a sudden jump up, but maybe you need to elevate a little bit and strive for something a little bit more than what you had set originally, because it's possible that maybe you have a reference point that's keeping you down.
It's possible.
But I think what Geoff was getting at was really like, you can get on there and go crazy, but the fact is like they're living drastically different lives than you. They have different careers. They live in different parts of the country. You don't know their philosophy of money and how much, they're leveraged or not leveraged. You don't know if they got an inheritance. Like there's just all sorts of stuff that you don't know when you're looking at somebody's life.
Yeah.
And so you have to pull back in and find a comparison who's actually more relevant to you. And a couple comparisons aren't a bad idea. Like the comparison to who you are today, and then that person who has that next version of yourself that you kind of like to have a little bit of that. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's a good example. If we go back to my example of sitting in the room while John Daly typed on the paper when I was a grad student, that's an endowed professor. And that is not who I should be thinking about. It was a lot more once I met Amy Smisher and Karen Cornetto and Stephanie Hamill, and there were others, but that kind of core group, and they were a few years ahead of me. They were also, water walkers and mentors of mine, but they weren't that far ahead. It was just about plausible that if I stretched a little, worked a little harder, I might in 3 years be able to be like them. Whereas to be like John Daly, it was going to take me 30.
Yeah.
And 30's too long to think about.
Right. And going back to the education piece, you have to be careful with the reference point that when you see somebody who is a reference point to you, a comparison other to you, who has a failure, that you just don't lose hope, right? Like that's what happened in my program. We had a class.
Talking about your PhD.
Yeah, the PhD program. We as a class, there were 4 of us. One of us got kicked out. All 3 of us had to redo parts of our comprehensive exam, which is a killer exam. And basically the class behind us, who we were close to, looked at it, and there were 5 students in it, and every single one of them but one just quit before the comprehensive exam. They gave a bunch of excuses, but they were devastated over seeing what happened to us.
Because to them, they were
they felt behind us.
Yeah.
And
sure.
And so they're like, well, there's just no way we're pulling out.
That's right. Yeah, if they couldn't do it, I can't do it. And when your whole reference group is wiped out, you find yourself mentally unmoored. And it's hard to, in a high pressure situation, not let your mind get the best of you in that situation. And so, well, that's a lot on reference group and comparison to others. Nerds, heads up, there's more reference group stuff coming when we're talking about comparisons, but we stuck mostly with people in this one. And I would say, here's my take on the takeaways, and you can tell me what yours are. My take on the takeaways is it's healthier to compare yourself today to your past self and to get a sense for how you're doing. That's a little bit more precise.
Happier. You're going to be happier.
Oh.
But there could be problems with that in that, like, you know, you don't really necessarily know how you're doing compared to others.
That if you actually found a good reference point, you might push yourself a little more.
Right.
When you look around and realize other people with what you have are actually doing more.
Right.
What we see more often, or what I see more often, is people who punish themselves with inaccurate comparison others or reference cases. And just a reminder, you're looking to compare yourself to people who are actually doing the thing you're doing in similar situations, and maybe they're a little bit ahead. So they give you a little bit of push. They're kind of the icebreaker, showing you what a little bit of your future may look like. But that's much more helpful and productive than picking your richest cousin or the person you barely know who posts a picture of themselves on a private jet on Facebook, and you're asking yourself, well, why am I not in a private? I mean, as Cindi pointed out, like, there's so many things you don't know about that story. And you don't even really know this person in the jet, and they're doing something completely different than you. And so what are you doing? Be accurate in your comparison to others, and in so doing, you'll be better to yourself.
I think that's a good summary.
All right. Okay.
That's it for today. Thank you for joining us today on Management Muse.
Appreciate you.
And we also appreciate the people who help us, Rebecca, Sarah, and Christina.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. And we appreciate you for being here. And we appreciate those of you who go out of your way to help us rise above and actually have some visibility on podcasts, because there are like 1 million podcasts out there. So we appreciate those stars, shares, likes.
All of it helps.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All of it. Y'all have a good one. We'll see you next time.
All righty.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to learn more about the topic, check out our show notes. And if you want to help us out, like, share, subscribe, and 5 stars are all deeply appreciated. See you next time on the Management Muse.